have shut, and we shall begin. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
That's so cool.
Thank you very much for attending what is a very important seminar called The Audacity of Sourced Whiskey. Before we get into it, I want to ask you to please download the Tales of the Cocktail app and rate the seminars you attend. There will be a slide at the end of the presentation to give you directions if you haven't already downloaded it. Please feel free to live tweet, Facebook, Instagram. You will not hurt our feelings if we're talking and you're on the phone doing the Twitter. That's cool. You will see at the end of every slide the hashtag and everybody's Twitter handle, should you want to do Twitter. Format of the presentation, we're each going to talk. After each one of us talks, John Little will lead us in a tasting. Then we will take questions. Please hold all your questions toward the end. We are being filmed for a live studio audience to later be clicked on the internet. Thank you. So I'd like to make some introductions. My name is Fred Minnick, the author of Whiskey Women and the upcoming book, Bourbon Curious, whiskey writer. This is Wade Woodward. He is an all-knowing consumer. Who happened to report several distilleries to the federal government for not disclosing their state of distillation. We have John Little, founder of Smooth Ambler Distillery in West Virginia. And David Dykstra, Vice President for NGP Ingredients, an unknown important person in this industry who's helped a lot of brands build whiskey portfolios. I want to start by telling you why this seminar is important. 10 years ago, no one gave a rat's ass about American whiskey. And then suddenly, everyone cared. And you had these new brands coming out of nowhere: High West, Templeton, Redemption, Smooth Ambler. All these brands were coming out of the woodworks from their own respective states, bringing in new consumers that bourbon and rye whiskey hadn't had in ages. People fell in love with these brands. And then they wanted to visit the Bullet Distillery, but they didn't find it. They wanted to visit and see the Templeton Distillery, but they did not see what they thought would be a large facility. So consumers felt deceived. That, of course, led to class action lawsuits and many of angry people on Twitter and Facebook calling these brands everything from scum to pieces of you-know-what. And then you had people like John Little with Smooth Ambler and in Utah with High West, who were sourcing whiskey legitimately, putting the state of distillation on the bottle, and then telling consumers where they procured the whiskey if they could. These people were being lumped in with those who were not doing that. And this created an outcry on their behalf, and sometimes they would get caught in the jet stream of the people not telling the truth about their whiskey. And that's why this seminar is important, is because I think the industry, consumers, and as we have seen in recent weeks, the courts are tired of this issue, and I hope it's one of the last times I have to talk about it professionally. So what is source whiskey? Source whiskey is a very broad term, but there are two types. There's contract distillation, where if you want to start a distillery, you work with a company to contract distill your product. You can purchase bulk whiskey, which is basically buying several barrels, usually in the 100 to 300 range, dump those barrels, and build your brand. In the old days, they would call that purchasing whiskey on wholesale receipts. These days, we call these companies non Non-Distiller Producers that was coined by my friend and Bourbon Hall of Famer Chuck Cowdery. But most of them operate under rectifier licenses. Now, this has been going on for a very long time. Since American whiskey filled its first barrel, there was a guy who couldn't afford to build his own distillery. So he called the guy down the street to distill for him. It's been going on forever. When Austin Nichols did not have its own facility, they contracted distillers throughout Kentucky. One of them was Stitzel Weller. Stitzel Weller and Pappy Van Winkle made a very nice living contract distilling for other companies. And once upon a time, they even made a vodka. So all of these companies have a long storied history of contract distilling for others. In the contemporary sense, Brown-Forman's one of the big contract distillers. After Heaven Hill's distillery burned down in 1996, they took on distilling a large portion of Heaven Hill's products. Kind of an unknown secret in the industry is that Brown-Forman also made Michter's up until Michter's created its facility. So they are behind the scenes, and a lot of people don't know about them, contract distilling. MGP, of course, contract distills, and many other companies contract distills. This new micro distiller movement that we're seeing, as soon as they open up and have their DSB and they've got whiskey churning out of the still, they're getting calls to contract distill for others. New Riff Distillery, Kentucky Artisans Distillery, Gentleman's Distillery in Bourbon County, Kentucky, which has been open for less than about a year, and it still is the size of my arm. It is already getting contract distillation clients. So it is a storied piece of the history. On the bulk whiskey market, it is also a storied piece of the history. You've had Barton Distillery, which has basically profited in the very lean years of American whiskey with selling bulk product to its competitors that would bottle it and compete against them. In the contemporary sense, Barton, which is owned by Sazerac, continues to sell source whiskey on the open market. But probably one of the bigger players, and if you see Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey on a bottle and you don't know where it came from, there's a very good chance it came from either Heaven Hill or Barton. An inside look to a specific brand that purchased source whiskey after Prohibition, Choppin' and Gore. Jim Gore was a real person in the 1800s who was a 49er, and he met this fella with some coin in his purse, and they decided to open a grocery store in Chicago that would later become a restaurant, and then they decided to start making whiskey. Jim Gore made really good whiskey, and in fact, during the Chicago fire, it rolled out, he saved his whiskey by rolling it out into the lake. When people came back from the fire and were saved, that whiskey was apparently silky smooth, and he became known for his incredible whiskey. And that was just one of the stories. He was filled with stories, and he had a sour mash recipe. He had a sour mash recipe that he did, and one of his brands was called Old Jim Gore Sour Mash. Well, Prohibition killed off that brand. After Prohibition, a brand called McKesson and Robbins purchased the rights to the distillery, or to the name, and they started marketing the history of Old Jim Gore, but they didn't exactly follow the proper history. There's a typo in there that is not Frank Gore, the running back for the Indianapolis Colts. It's Jim Gore, but he was a legitimate whiskey maker, but nowhere in his history did he say he made the original, the very first sour mash. But McKesson and Robbins said he did, and nobody cried foul. And in fact, this is one of the many examples in history where parent companies use backstories of history and falsify history just to sell product. We do that today in Templeton, and we have a public outcry. You know, Templeton, Iowa is this very historic town. During Prohibition, it was making rye whiskey for the likes of Al Capone and others. All true, a lot of people went to prison for it. And in fact, today they still make illegal product there, but they don't like to talk about it. One of the big growths in the last 10 years has been rye whiskey. And one of the reasons why is because the distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana opened up its stocks, and it put them on the open market for people to buy. Templeton was essentially created to acquire those stocks, and they created this brand, and they used that backstory. People fell in love with the whiskey, Iowans fell in love with it, and once people found out that it was not legitimately made 100% in Iowa, people were upset. And they actually sued the Templeton, which just settled 2 or 3 days ago. And so that's a little bit of a difference between historically of how we looked at source whiskey and today. That's the still actually in Templeton, Iowa, that they have on display. So why don't people disclose where their whiskey comes from? There's several legitimate reasons why. It's going to shock people to know that they can't always tell you how many whiskeys are going into a certain batch. Jefferson's is an example. At any given time, they'll have 3 to 6 distilleries in their bottlings. Doesn't mean the whiskey's bad. It just means that they have a lot of whiskey coming in. You also have a lot of whiskeys that Heaven Hill picked up from other brands that they are now brokering to someone else. So while the person is buying it from Heaven Hill, it could have been from the old Medley facility in Owensboro in the 90s. Same with Stitzel-Weller. Stitzel-Weller acquired a lot of stocks from the Stagg Distillery, which is now Buffalo Trace. They would resell it, and people would say it's from Stitzel-Weller, but in reality, it was from George T. Stagg. So it's kind of complicated. But when they say they don't know, they really don't know. And they also have to sign non-disclosure agreements. Brown-Forman, Sazerac, Heaven Hill, these companies do not want other companies encroaching on their trademarks. They don't want people saying, you know, this is really good. It tastes just like Evan Williams Single Barrel. You know, to them, that hurts the sales of Evan Williams Single Barrel, or whatever it is. So that is a huge, huge reason why. And in fact, when distilleries have attempted a bit of transparency, lawyers often get involved when it comes to origins of the said whiskey stocks. And of course, everyone's favorite reason why is they don't want to. They bought the stocks. They don't feel like it's anybody else's business where it came from and where they bottled it. You know, they'll follow the rules, they'll follow the state laws, the federal laws, but they want to build their brand. They don't want to build the origins of the whiskey brand, because it may very well change. It may change in 10 years. It may change in 5 years. Hell, they may not be in business tomorrow. So who cares where the whiskey came from? They're trying to capture that new consumer every single time, and in their opinion, disclosing where the whiskey comes from is not important. And now I will turn it over to John, who will tell you where his whiskey came from in the first tasting.
Well, Fred, the first one's interesting because I can't tell you where the first one came from. So the first whiskey that we're going to taste here is the Old Scout Rye. And part of the story that we'll get into a little bit later, which I find the most interesting, is this whiskey was made at MGPI. When we got, I'll get into that to the business part of it a little bit later, but we bought this whiskey from another distillery in Kentucky who made us sign a non-disclosure, as Fred mentioned, about where it came from. Sadly, they did that to us. But this is the Old Scout Rye. This is MGPI's rye mash bill. It's, as many of you guys know, I'm sure everybody in here knows, this is a unique rye whiskey, as opposed to having at least 51% rye and a little bit of corn and a little bit of malted barley. This is 95% rye and 5% malt, so no corn at all in this mash bill. So we like to talk about how this whiskey is really the true, sort of part of the true pioneer spirit. The real rye whiskey was, as you guys know, was one of the first spirits made in America, considered American whiskey. And we think this is a great example of that. So we procure this whiskey from a variety of sources. This whiskey is a blend of 7 and 8 year old barrels. All of the whiskey that we do is non-chill filtered, and we bottle this at 99 proof. So we go into the distillery and pick barrels that we like. We drill the ends of those barrels. It's a very simple process. We drill the ends of the barrels. We pull a sample out. If they're approved, they go to a master batch, and then we blend about 4 or 5 barrels together. So we dump the barrels. We run them through a really small filtration process just to remove the bits of the barrel, and this is the result of that. This 7-year-old rye whiskey. If you want to taste that. Great. Yeah, this is really delicious whiskey. It has that sort of spiciness. It also has the sweetness. You pick up that very distinct, what we call that very distinct MGPI sort of mint eucalyptus note in the spirit. Pretty good. All right, so I'm past my time already.
So I'm Wade Woodward. I'm up here next to a well-known whiskey book author, the owner of a very successful craft distillery, and a VP of marketing from the largest one of the largest whiskey distillers in America. And so you might be asking, what am I doing up here just as a consumer? Facebook. Well, I've really taken a consumer advocate position about this topic that we're talking about today. I've tried to become the Ralph Nader of the whiskey business. So personally, I'm a big-time whiskey geek. I have over 500 bottles of whiskey at home, much to my wife's dismay. And the collection seems to be growing, not shrinking. Hi, honey. I'm a certified spirit specialist from the Society of Wine Educators, and this is my 5th year at Tell's. The first 4 years I came as that category of cocktail enthusiast. Obviously this year I'm a speaker, but I'm also, as of 2 months ago, working in the industry. I just recently took a position with Garrison Brothers, a Texas bourbon distillery, as that's Dan Garrison, as a bourbon evangelist. That's my official title. That's on my business card. I get to go out and preach the good word about bourbon. I'll give a little Garrison plug. We have an event tonight, a paid event, but Made in America happy hour that I'll be at tonight at 5:30. And then we have a free tasting room on Saturday, the Taste of the Revolution, sponsored by the ACSA at 10:30 a.m. So stop by and see me. I love to pour you a sample. So the craft and non-distilling producer, NDP, business really started flourishing in the past 5 years. And I'm a Texan. And Texans, we're a proud people. We like to support brands that say they're made in Texas. And I started noticing as I was going into my local retail liquor store that every time there would be new brands out there and they were claiming to be Texas whiskeys. But they had age statements of 4 years, and I did some basic research on these companies and found out they'd only been in business 2 months. So I put 2 and 2 together and realized this whiskey was not really made in Texas. And, there's a lot of marketing fluff out there on labels. Has Jim Beam really been using the same yeast for 200 years? Is Elijah Craig really the founder of bourbon? And those kind of things, they're they're statements, but they're kind of marketing fluff. But if you said something was Texas whiskey and it wasn't, I got to wondering, is that really legal to do it? And from that, I decided to start reading our Code of Federal Regulations, the CFRs. We basically have laws that define every single class type of spirit out there. There's actually 503 different class types. My personal favorite is 101, which is straight bourbon whiskey, but there's a lot of them out there. And as I was reading through these federal laws, and there's pages and pages, I read through them so you don't have to. I found one that I thought, aha, and a typo on the screen there, but it's really 27 CFR 5.36D. This is complicated. You can read through this. It's been up on here on the screen for a while. But if I tried to simplify this, I'll go to my next slide. Basically, the point of this law is the actual state of distillation must be on the label if it's from a producer from some other state. And it only applies to certain class types. There are certain class types that were exempted, such as light whiskeys or blended whiskeys or spirit whiskeys. And I could tell you what I think about all those categories in a different conversation. Drink straight bourbon. But I wanted to know what particular types that this law did apply to. And as we get to the heart of it, it applies to all straight whiskeys. It applies to all bottled and bond whiskeys. And it applies to any product labeled bourbon, rye, or corn whiskey. And I quickly realized that many of these Texas brands were obviously not complying with this law. So the first thing I did is I emailed the TTB. They're in charge of enforcement of the laws, and I asked them, am I reading this law correctly? Maybe it's been superseded by something else. And they sent me an email back response saying, no, the law is pretty straightforward, and it is a valid law. It's still in place. So then I asked, well, how come you're not enforcing this law? Simple question. And the answer was, go to my next slide, they really depend on a system of self-compliance. It's up to the producers to turn in an honest label that complies with all laws. And there's actually a statement, this is on every label that gets submitted to the federal government, that you have, under penalties of perjury, complied with all applicable laws for your product. And I point this out because I've had some producers try to tell me that their product's perfectly fine, they got TTB label approval, so it's okay. And it's really not okay. It's like me or you, we could file a false tax return to the IRS, and we might get away with it for a few years, but likely the IRS would eventually catch up to us, and we wouldn't be able to use the excuse to the IRS that you accepted my return, therefore it's good. Obviously that wouldn't work. It also doesn't work with the TTB. There's no safe harbor for turning in a falsified label information. And some people, when I kind of started doing this, told me, mind my own business, just don't buy those products. You know, it's not harming you in any way. And I call bullshit to that. In particular, thank you. In particular, there was one local craft distillery that came out with a new rye whiskey. And I had saw their federal label that went to the government for approval, and it had complied. It said distilled in Indiana on the label that the government approved. Then a few weeks later, I saw the owner of this company at my local retailer, and he was pouring samples for customers. And I picked up the label and I looked at it, but you know what was missing? The distilled in Indiana. It was no longer on there. So I asked him about it, and he said he had talked to his retailer, and his retailer said, if you put that on there, customers won't think it's a Texas whiskey and you won't sell as much of it. And I said, but you know it's the law. And his response to me was, everybody else is doing it, it's just business. So I was very frustrated with that. And I've also seen at the same retailer, customers that walk in and they ask for a recommendation of a Texas whiskey. And the salespeople will take them over to these products that I know the only thing that Texas is about it is maybe the water they use to cut the whiskey and bottling it here. And this is what they'll tell the customers is a Texas whiskey. So, and for consumers, if you look at the labels of these products, 99% of the people are going to be fooled. They write the labels to where you would think it was a Texas whiskey. So I didn't think this was fair to the true craft distillers out there that were making whiskey from grain to glass, and also to companies like Smooth Ambler that were being honest about what they were doing in selling source whiskey and properly complying to the law. It's deceptive to consumers, it's against the law, and it's not fair to the distilleries that do it right. So I decided to take a next step, and I contacted the TTB, and I said, hey, I know of several companies that I suspect are in violation. And they said, well, send us a list. So I did. I sent them a list of over 20 companies, and through subsequent emails and other people then contacting me and said, hey, Wade, add this one to your list. That list got eventually up to over 75 different companies. And truthfully, I probably could double that if I wanted to. I wrote my U.S. congressman, and I said, hey, you need to talk to the TTB, and you need to get them to actually enforce our laws. On a social media platform, Facebook, I started telling people about what I was doing. I posted this list as a Google spreadsheet where anybody could see it and actually add products to it. I went to the Straight Bourbon internet forums, and I told people what I was doing. Then I had people like Fred that contacted me and interviewed and blogged about it, as well as another well-known whiskey writer and blogger, Chuck Cowdery, started taking up the subject and mentioning me and what I was doing. So in a whiskey geek circle, it became very wide known and discussed, but eventually it even got further. There was a news site, the Daily Beast, I don't know if any of you follow news from that site, but they eventually wrote an article of your craft whiskey is probably made at a factory in Indiana. And that really made the whole story hit the mainstream. Well, in studying the label applications that go to the TTB, I noticed there was always an email address from the company that submitted the labels. So I decided to take the next step, and I started emailing these companies back and saying, hey, do you distill your own product? And if not, are you aware of 5.36D? And some of them actually were totally unaware of this and changed their labels to comply. And John's one. I contacted him and said, hey man, you got to do this. He was already in the process of doing it, and now it's totally compliant. Now, for some other craft distilleries that I contacted, let's just say I'm never going to be on their Christmas card mailing list. One of the emails that I kept seeing over and over again on these labels was Robert Learman. So I looked him up, and he has a law firm, and they specialize in dealing with the TTB and with label submissions. So I called Robert up, and we talked, and again, even though he was a law firm specializing in this, he was unaware of the 5.36D requirement. But once I pointed it out to him, he actually said he had a legal obligation now to go back to his past clients and as well as future customers and tell them about this law and make sure that the labels he was submitting was correct. And I met Robert earlier this year in Austin, and now he's pitching his law firm services to help companies avoid lawsuits about labeling issues. So he's turned this around and made more of a business out of it. He actually runs a very good blog that deals with spirits in the law. It's Bev Law, Bev as in beverages, LAW.com, and then from there you can click on the blog link. So one of the potential violators that I reported to the TTB was Templeton Rye. It was well speculated that they were sourcing from MGP, but their bottle never said distilled in Indiana. It said the made and produced in Iowa statement. And a reporter from the Des Moines Registry newspaper in Iowa decided to write a story about his local craft distillery and what was going on with the industry. He contacted me and interviewed me and quoted me in the article that he wrote, and this article really turned out to be the final straw for Templeton. About a week later, after that article was published, that so many Iowans knew the truth, they came forward and said, we're buying from Indiana, we're going to start following the law, we're going to put distilled in Indiana on the product. So that made a difference. But speaking of Templeton, and I'll move on to the topic of lawsuits. There's a lot of law firms out there that specialize in class action lawsuits, and they see blood in the water, and they're suing everybody. Some of these lawsuits I find a little silly, like Maker's Mark got sued for not being handmade. And I find that silly because every bottle of Maker's Mark is hand-dipped. So there's definitely hands in the process. And even at a big distillery, there's hands involved in every step of the process. Another thing is the TTB, there's never any definition of what handmade is when it comes to spirits. So earlier this year in May, a U.S. district judge agreed with that and actually dismissed this case. But as Fred mentioned earlier, Templeton just settled 3 class action lawsuits for what they did with the labeling of not saying distilled in Indiana properly and following the law. So if you bought Templeton Rye, be a lookout in your mailbox because you could be receiving a refund check soon. $3 a bottle, right? Yeah. If anybody here is a craft distiller and you're not in compliance with 5.36D, I suggest you walk out of this room and contact your lawyer and start getting your label resubmitted so you can be in compliance. That's the way to avoid those lawsuits. So, has one man on a mission made a difference? I was not one man. I had a lot of help along the way from Fred and Chuck and support from a lot of true craft distillers. And I know I have made a difference. In talking to Mr. Learman, the attorney, he's told me now that the TTB pays much stricter attention when new labels are submitted, and they're making sure that the labels comply to 5.36D. Has the TTB done anything to the companies that I reported? Unfortunately, it's their policy never to comment on any corrective action, so I'm not for sure. They just say they'll take corrective action as needed. I'd like to point out an example of a craft distillery in Texas that makes a product called red-handed bourbon. And obviously the name, as implies, it was always kind of joking that they source this whiskey. You caught us red-handed selling our bourbon whiskey. But the original label did not comply with 5.36D. It said produced by Treaty Oak Distilling Company, but it didn't say what particular states it was distilled in. Once they found out, they listened, and this is their new label now. And I find it interesting. It's distilled in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Indiana, which means they source this product from 3 different distilleries, and they blend this together then to create a unique whiskey. And there's an art in blending. So I appreciate the fact that they follow the law. So if you're trying to figure out if a product is sourced, there is kind of a key on the back of the label. If you see words like produced by or handcrafted by or bottled by, those are key words to we likely source this whiskey. If you see distilled by, that's something that the TTB pays attention to. And if you see distilled by followed by the company's name and the city and state, you can pretty much take it to the bank on a whiskey that they actually distilled the product. So what I would like to ask is attendees here, support the products that are being honest with their labels and stop supporting the products that are deceitful. Thank you.
All right, so the next tasting we'll do is the Old Scout 10. This is whiskey that we did obtain from MGPI. It was owned by another one of their clients, another one of the people that they do contract distillation for. This is their low rye recipe. So MGPI makes, well, they make a bunch of stuff that David will tell you about in a little bit, but predominantly they've been known for 3 whiskeys, which are the rye whiskey, a low rye bourbon, and a high rye bourbon. And this is the low rye. This is 75% corn, 21% rye, and 4% malted barley. And this is a blend of 10 and 11-year-old whiskey that is also unchill filtered. And this one is bottled at 100 proof. So very sweet from that high corn content. You get that nice big creamy mouthfeel from the spirit, since we don't chill filter, just a really delicious whiskey. And then we use that as part of our base in a product that we'll taste a little bit later called Contradiction. Everybody tasted this already? Great. So, you like that? Great. You guys are hardcore. So I want to go over a couple things. One of them is to tell you guys a little bit about just Smooth Ambler in general. You know, how we got started. I think it's kind of a cool story. So we do both make whiskey and we source whiskey. The way we got started was my father-in-law and I were in another business completely unrelated to alcohol, and we were looking for ways to add value to the community that we live in. And we had tons of ideas. I mean, making furniture, being a call center for a big guy, all sorts of stuff. And he saw this article in Time magazine that talked about the growth of the micro distilling business. And Hudson Whiskey, you know, the Tuttletown boys were in there. And he wrote a little smart-ass comment on the top of the page and said, "We can do this in your garage." And I didn't have a $3 million garage, so we built one. And that really became the manifesto for what started us in business. That was in 2008. We spent about 2 years trying to figure it out. I fell in love with the idea really early on through a conference in Louisville. And then we opened our doors in 2010 and started producing whiskey and vodka and gin and a variety of things. So we have been producing whiskey since, or have been producing spirits since March 24th of 2010. So just a little over 5 years into the business. The way that we got into the source whiskey business was sort of by chance. We were at Vendome trying to buy some equipment. If you guys that don't know Vendome is the guys who make stills for everybody. They, you know, Jack Daniels and Jim Beam and Maker's Mark. They make all those stills for all those guys. They are a wonderful company that makes, you know, really wonderful handcrafted copper and stainless steel. And we were there, and we found out that there were people in the industry that actually brokered spirits. I'd never heard of this. You know, we were only a year and a half or so into the business, and so I called this guy up, and the guy's name is Richard Wolf, and he's sort of he's known in the industry as a guy who buys and sells spirits of all sorts. And I called him up, and he sent me a couple of samples. He sent me a lot of samples of stuff, and what I found out was that it was sort of the dirty part of the business that we never knew about, that there was all these spirits that were for sale by a variety of distilleries. You should know that they're not available anymore. That business has changed just in the 3 or 4 years. But and so we got him to send us some samples, and he sent us stuff from all sorts of large distilleries who were selling excess spirits. And we decided on, I think it was maybe the 10th or 11th spirit that we tried, and we decided on that spirit, which became the Old Scout Bourbon, our most popular spirit, the one that we're actually not tasting today. But it's the High Rye Bourbon from MGPI. And we loved it instantly, right? We tasted it. I knew I was going to buy it the moment I smelled it, because it has these wonderful notes of sort of dried cherries and leather and tobacco. And I knew the moment that I smelled it that was going to be the whiskey for us. And what I liked about it once we tasted it was that it was very different in 3 ways. Well, it was special in 3 ways. It was different from anything that we made. Predominantly, we make a wheated bourbon. It was different from anything on the market because we didn't know of anything that had such a high rye content. It's 36% rye, and it was just damn delicious. So we knew that was what we wanted to buy. So we bought 40 barrels to begin with, and then we had some success with it, and then we bought 80. And then we bought 80 or 120. I can't remember the third purchase. And then luckily, I have a really good investor, and he said, "Buy all you can buy." And he sent me out with a blank check, and that's what we did. And so we bought tons of barrels that were sitting in MGPI's warehouse. And I actually talked my investor out. He wanted to buy like 7,000 barrels. I grew up in a 980 square foot house, and writing a check for like that many millions of dollars seemed impossible. In hindsight, we should have just bought all those and sold them 3 years from now and just gotten out of the business. That'd have been the most profitable thing to do. So anyway, when we started in this business, we knew all these people were doing this, were buying spirits, and were not being open and honest about it. And so we, instead of trying to focus on what those guys did, we tried to take another approach. We tried to look at people who were doing it right. And for you guys who have seen merchant bottlers from Scotland, those are the guys that we really thought were doing it right. They were buying spirits from a distillery. They were aging them in some special way, or aging them longer, or doing special barrel treatments on them. Signatory is one of the people that comes to mind, if you guys know Signatory. Just a wonderful merchant bottler. So why were we focusing on people who were doing it wrong instead of let's focus on people who were doing it right? So what we decided we would do is we would create a name for the brand that spoke to the honesty and integrity that we wanted to put out in our spirits. And as it turned out, when we were naming Smooth Ambler, one of the names that we wanted to use was Old Scout. So it was right in our pocket. So as soon as we had this idea for the merchant bottling, we just thought Old Scout, what a great name for scouting the whiskey out, going to find good whiskey. And from the very beginning, our label says this is sourced whiskey. Now, as you guys can imagine from Wade's conversation, this is not the first time Wade and I have talked about this. We were not in compliance early on with the label. We did not list the state of distillation. That was an error on our part. And as you might imagine, there are tons of laws. The CFR that controls this, the Code of Federal Regulations that controls alcohol production, is lengthy, and it's hard to get it all right. We never intended to fool anybody. Our label said we didn't make it. We told people we didn't make it. We were trying to take the approach to not only try to not fool people. We wanted to be open and honest and to tell everybody that's what we were doing. That's where we thought the home run was. We've since corrected that. As Wade said, we found out that we were not in compliance at a TTB conference. Kind of a hard time to find out you're not compliant when you're standing in front of a bunch of government officials. But that's when we found out. We corrected it with our lawyer, who is Robert Lerman, that Wade talked about. And when Wade called us, we were already in the process of fixing our labels. So it's been important for us to be open and honest about this from the very, very get-go. What it's meant to our business is really significant, and I think that's the part that that Fred and I have talked about a lot. This has been a wonderful thing for our business. We were a couple of years late to the vodka and gin market from craft distilling standpoint, so the market was a little flooded when we first started. And so we were able to source these spirits and bring them to market. And I can remember walking into a liquor store and them telling me, don't bring anything white. I don't want to taste anything that's white. And when you only have something that's white, you're in trouble. So when we started selling these spirits, it was even hard for our distributors to understand, hey, we don't make this, and we want you to be open and honest about it. I remember these guys over here in the corner over here from Henry Wine Group, one of our distributors, and I remember walking in there and telling them that, and they couldn't fathom it. Or they couldn't understand that we didn't make it. Not these two guys, but some of the other salespeople couldn't understand that we didn't make the whiskey, and that we wanted them to tell people that we didn't make it. But it's been great because, as you can imagine, it's been good for our cash flow. It's allowed us to properly age our own spirits when we've released stuff at a young age, which you'll taste one in a minute, call our Yearling. We've done so because we wanted to. I'm on time, about 8 minutes. So it's allowed us to really hold on to our whiskey now and age it properly. So we have about 5. The oldest whiskey we have is right at 5 years old now. Thank you, buddy. So it's been wonderful for that part of our business. The other thing that I think it's done for us is this allowed us to grow our brand. So when people, I think for the most part, I'm saying this a little bit nervous in front of all these people now, but when people think of Smooth Ambler and Old Scout, we hope they think of, they know what quality is, and those guys are going to do it the right way. And so I think that's given us a leg up so that when we release our own whiskey, we're not starting from scratch now. We're starting with an existing reputation that we know what we're doing. And so that's been hugely important for us. What we do now, or where do we go from here? This is the tricky question. One of the faults of the Old Scout line is that we bought this whiskey, we bought all of this whiskey at one time, the majority of it at one time. So we have a couple of flaws. It's going to run out, and it's continually aging. So the whiskey that we have is continually getting older. We've just now entered into some contract distillation with MGPI where they're making the Old Scout recipe and the Old Scout 10 recipe for us. But it's 8 months old, something like that. we got a long time to wait before we have Old Scout 10 again. So that is the flaw in the business. So what we're constantly trying to do now is trying to find other spirits. We're trying to find, we're continuing trying to find bourbon and rye and anything else that we find is interesting. We just bought some Jamaican rum, a 20, it's good, right? It's good. All right, that's what I love to hear. So it's 23 years old and 25-year-old light rum. It was made in Jamaica at 2 different distilleries that I can't disclose. One of those distilleries is mothballed. It was moved to Canada in some purchasing agreement, and then we bought it from Canada, and we bring it in-house, and we blend it and release it as this product called Revelation Rum. We're actually doing some rye treatments on one now and a fresh bourbon barrel finish treatment on it. And that's the thing that we really want to get into. We want to get into blending more so than what we already do. We want to get into for us, it's about telling the story. That's really what we want to do. I've approached a couple of large distilleries about 6 months ago and said, hey, why don't we take this signatory idea and bring it to the U.S.? Why don't we buy something from Heaven Hill or take 5 of these barrels that you don't really know what they went to? You guys would be shocked. Big distilleries make whiskey all the time, and then they mysteriously lose 5 or 10 barrels. I thought that was BS. It's the truth. And so I would love to be able to go find these 5 barrels that they can't do anything with and to blend them or to age them or to do something with them in their own unique way and to make them into wonderful whiskey. I don't need 1,000 barrels to make a brand. I need 3 barrels to make something really cool. And that's what we're trying to do. So far, man, that idea has been completely stonewalled. Nobody has any understanding about how to make that work, and I think that's sad. What's interesting for us, or what we want to do, is we want to find those really interesting whiskey. We want to find a partner. We want to find someone who will say, who made the whiskey? Where was it aged? How was it aged? What floor was it stored on? How was it obtained? These are some great stories to tell. For all of you guys who love whiskey, who are constantly trying to figure out what Stetzer Weller does and what Pappy Van Winkle does and what MGPI does, why would you not want to tell the story? Sorry, I can get passionate about this. It makes me excited. Like, I really want people to understand where these whiskeys come from. This seems to me like it would create more brand loyalty than anything else. And that is where we're trying to go. That's what we're trying to do. That's sort of our current mission statement. So whether it's blending or telling these great stories, that's really what we're trying to do. And that's really it. That's really it for me, for my part. If anybody has any questions about stuff, you can ask me at the end. Oh yeah, I'm gonna do the tasting. Let's taste Yearling real quick, and then we'll get to any other questions. Taste what? The rum? I've got some in my room.
David goes next before questions, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. So this is Yearling. This is our own house-produced whiskey. After we've tasted the rye and we've tasted the Old Scout 10, definitely going to know this is young whiskey. This is 3 years and 3 months on this bottle, I think, on this batch. It's really young. You taste the corn in it. And some people say, well, why do you release these young whiskeys? But we get asked for it. People love this whiskey. I'm amazed how often in the distillery we taste Old Scout and Old Scout Bourbon and Yearling, and everybody goes, yeah, I'll take the Yearling. I'm continually amazed that people like that young whiskey. And it's creamy, it's sweet, it's very corny. I think it shows great promise for what this whiskey is going to be when it's 5, 6, 7, 12 years old. And it's also an integral part, that young sort of, that freshness and that creaminess, I think, plays an integral part in the next product that we'll taste, which is the Contradiction.
John, I want to share a story with you about tasting young bourbons up against some of the elite bourbons. I do a lot of tastings for the Kentucky Derby Museum, and I had a wedding from out of state that I was doing a tasting for, and I used them as kind of guinea pigs, getting paid, and they were my guinea pigs. It was kind of fun. But I had all these bourbons up there. I had Hudson, I had Blanton's, Buffalo Trace, Woodford, Double O. I had about 10 bourbons, and I had them all vote for their favorite bourbon. The younger crowd selected Hudson. So there is something to be said for young, the grain-forward kind of little bit of wood touch. A lot of people like those. With that said, a distillery that never releases anything over oaked. David?
I wouldn't say that. I want to thank you all for having me here to talk about the sourced spirits business. It is the dirty little word. It isn't the dirty little word in the industry. That we don't at least think so. But I want to start with a little bit of history of MGP because it really kind of follows the source spirits industry. And MGP was founded in 1941, and soon thereafter World War II started. So right away, the company started producing alcohol for the U.S. government in total, no other customer. And they did that for 4 years. And they were one of 64 plants that started producing for the war effort, and there's now 2 left. Ourselves, and then a company called Grain Processing Corporation, which also is a supplier of white goods to the sourced industry. But when the war ended, basically 1946, say, the company found itself, it did not have one single customer. And at that time, the industrial alcohol business was supplied almost entirely by the synthetic alcohol market. It was much cheaper, oil was extremely cheap, and so grain-based spirits couldn't compete with that cost structure. So the only thing that the company could do, and Bud Cray, who is the founder's son and is still alive today, was in charge of sales. He went to the beverage alcohol industry, the big guys of the day, the Shinleys, Seagrams, Hubeline, which is the predecessor to what's now known as Diageo, and others, and came up with this idea that if you had one plant that was large, the cost structure would be much less. And therefore, their cost of goods would go down over time over what they had currently, which were a bunch of small little plants producing, say, 1 million gallons each or something to that effect, where our facility at that time was producing probably, 20 million gallons or say. So today it's much larger than that. But ironically, the first company he got to agree to it and essentially saved MGP ingredients as we know it today, because they were going broke, was Seagram's, and in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. And Seagram's then was a customer of MGP ingredients for the next 53 years until they were sold to Diageo and Pernod in 2000. And that's how MGP Ingredients got into the sourced spirits business. In 1950, the company bought the McCormick Distilling Company. Most people don't realize that we did own brands for 44 years, but we sold McCormick in 1994. Why McCormick is important is because it allowed us to get into the whiskey business. McCormick produced whiskey, and we produced whiskey there from 1950 to 1980. And we not only supplied our own brands, but we started selling to other customers. Those same customers that we were selling grain neutral spirits and gin to, we now were selling whiskey to. And then the business had gotten so large, by 1980, the company had to, it went out and purchased the American Distilling Company in Pekin, Illinois, which was a big company. One of their brands was Fleshman's. I don't remember what the rest of them were. But we purchased that company and produced whiskey there. And the Pekin, Illinois facility for that time was quite large. It produced 37,000 gallons of whiskey a day. And the company, we produced and sold whiskey there from 1980 to 1993. And in the 90s, I think probably most of you are aware, the whiskey business was terrible. And so we shut it down, tore down the whiskey facility. It still has a vodka distillery there that still operates today. But, and then we continued to sell product through the 90s until November of 1999. Finally, all the stocks were sold. And so we exited the whiskey business for the next 12 years until we purchased the Seagrams, or what was then, we'll just call it the Lawrenceburg, Indiana facility, but it was the old Seagrams facility. We purchased it in 2011, and what's, other than getting us back into the whiskey business, what was really important, as we found out after we bought it, what was so important for us was that it gave us grand expertise in blending. The people that work there, the quality people and the master distiller and just all the employees have a great knowledge of blending products, blending bourbons, blending just different whiskeys, which we didn't have as a company when we were in the whiskey business. And that becomes important, as I'll talk here in a little bit, of why each of our customers have unique products. And it's through blending, and I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But, you know, why, I'm sure most of you, so why do companies want to work with MGPI, and why is the sourced spirits business so valuable to the industry? And first is, MGP does not discriminate. We don't have brands. So we supply all levels of the alcohol business. That includes the large multinationals that everyone knows. It's the regional rectifiers. It's the independent bottlers. And obviously we supply the craft industry, why we're all here today. And we offer 4 things to each of those levels of companies. First, we feel a very high quality new distillate that they can buy from us and then age at our facility if they so choose. Secondly, like John was talking about, we supply aged whiskey. And we are aging whiskey right now, but nothing that's 10 years old. We supply aged whiskey to the industry, so brands like John can get into the business and create cash flow so they can survive. Third, we have warehouses to age whiskey in, and warehouses have been in the news a lot because everyone's building them, and we're no different. And it's a huge expense to build a building to put barrels in. It's millions of dollars, and so we provide that service for our customers. And fourth, and probably the most important, is we offer product development. And we help our customers develop products. They can come into our facility, work with our quality people, do some R&D. They can come in, use our lab. It's just a service we provide for our customers. So that's important. And secondly, why the sourced industry is so important, it really is just an allocation of scarce capital that the industry has. Our 2 distilleries today have a replacement value of about $200 million. They are large distilleries. But so our customers can use our resources to then go out and invest their money or their scarce capital, and everybody has capital problems, it doesn't matter how big you are, in branding, in better distribution, in new packaging, those types of things. So it's really just allocating resources effectively for the industry. You can still produce for yourselves like John does, but we do provide a valuable service for our company, for our customers. We do have a commitment to our customers. We do not disclose who our customers are. And we take that very seriously. We are not the brand owner. And so we get asked all the time to disclose our customer list and those types of things, but that will never occur. That's up to the brand owner to decide whether they disclose. They can. We do have non-disclosure agreements as far as we won't disclose who they are, but we do not have a non-disclosure agreement that says they cannot disclose who we are. And so we don't get involved in labels. We see things that are inaccurate as well at times, but we never talk to our customers about that. That's not our role in the industry. Our role is to be a good producer, make good quality products for our customers. And as I start to close here, there's 2 or 3 things I'd like for you to remember about MGP Ingredients. We produce 13 different mash bills today. That's a lot of mash bills for anybody. It's challenging at times. But what that does is our customers then can select different products to blend. And that's where the blending comes in. And so even though Company A may buy a stock mash bill from MGP Ingredients as the same as and Company B may buy a stock mash bill that could be the same, through the blending, as John mentioned, those products are not the same. And I guarantee you there probably is a small segment of the population that can really tell that they came from Indiana, but it's a very small part. And you can put experts in a room and can't tell that John's 21% rye is the same as Company B's 21% rye. And it's all through blending. That's very important for the industry. And that's what we have found out as we've owned the facility. And sourcing product from companies like MGPI is good for the industry. It's not a dirty little secret. It's been going on for a long time. And it in effect allows small companies to compete with large multinational companies and allows for variety in the industry. Otherwise, you would have, Jack Daniels and Evan Williams and have pretty much nothing else. There would be, just a handful of different big brands. And lastly, as a company, MGP is very dedicated to being a distiller, and we value the art and the craft of distilling. We take great pride that our products win awards and those types of things. And so we understand that our products are going to be tasted by consumers, and we want our customers to be successful. Thank you.
I've got a couple questions for David before John gets to his tasting, then we take your questions. But first, I want to point out that MGP Ingredients distiller Greg Metz is not someone you will see at a festival or anything like that. His knuckles are thick as rocks and his boots are dirty. The man is distilling every single day. He is a true master distiller. I will say that, like he is a real distiller. So David, let's say I want to start a bourbon brand. Let's say we're going to call it Old Ascot. Fine name, by the way. We're going to start the Old Ascot brand. How many barrels of whiskey do I need to get going, and how much money do I need from soup to nuts to start? Bring back Old Ascot.
Well, the barrels are a choice, I guess. In my eyes, this is David Dykstra talking. Some people buy just 10 barrels, 20 barrels. John said he started with 40 and then 80. But to have a consistent product over time, the way I would choose to do it is that you should buy 1, 2, 3, and 4-year-old to start. So the 1, 2, and 3 are aging as you go forward. So if you look at it from that aspect, just in inventory, you're going to need, I'll just say, between $400,000 and $1 million to start. To do it.
That's for one bottling? Is that for one bottling?
That's for one brand.
One brand.
Well, you could have several different brands off of it, I guess, but that's how I would look at it, because you need to buy all 4 years worth to start. Many can't do that, but that's the right way to do it.
And you no longer have aged product just on the market.
We are not currently selling any aged product. Yeah.
But that's not. So you do have aged product. It's just not on the market.
We are aging product. Yes, but we're not. We're not. Yes. Yes, we are aging product. It's not available for sale yet.
So that's a great segue to our next product at Taste, which is Contradiction.
Do me a favor and hand me that bottle, the last one, the number 4.
Thank you, David.
All right, so this is Contradiction. This is probably the product that we're most proud of anything that we do. And the reason why is that took a lot of work, first of all, and a great deal of time. But this is a blend of our two very different efforts. So this is a blend of the low rye mash bill from MGPI, which we tasted second, which was the Old Scout 10, and a blend of our Yearling whiskey. And we played around with a bunch of different combinations of those spirit percentages, high rye bourbons, different products that we make, and we finally settled on this. And we think it's wonderful. So what happens is we basically dump these two spirits into a tank. We blend them together, we dilute the proof, and then we put them back into the same casks that they just came out of. That's important because when you do that, you don't have to worry about age statements. One other reason we're proud of this is because we thought we would take this opportunity to be as clear on our disclosure as there has ever been on any label. And what it says is, I'll read this to you, expertly blended from whiskeys distilled in both West Virginia and Indiana. 27% straight bourbon whiskey 2 years old, 73% straight bourbon whiskey 9 years old. And for us, this was the opportunity to sort of to take a leadership position on labeling, and that was equally important for us.
And now,
This has also become, I'll say one thing, this has also become probably our most popular whiskey, or at least people tell us that it's their favorite. We get this all the time now. So that obviously makes us really proud. So thanks.
it's fine whiskey. So now is the fun part where we get to take questions. And do I have someone in the back to carry the microphone around for folks? Because we have to get this recorded for film.
Mr. Garrison in the back there, he was the first to raise his hand, I believe. But please wait for the microphone. If actually you guys, if you just want to stand in the middle and have people come to you, or you can go to them, whatever's your preference. And we have close to 20 minutes for questions, so I made sure we would leave plenty of time.
Is this on? Hey, John. I just want to say thanks to you guys. You know, your honesty has changed everybody else's attitude, and I was a pissed off guy for a very long time, and I'm really glad to see what's happening now. I appreciate that very much. David, I want to take Fred's question a little bit further if I could. How much 4-year-old stock do you have in terms of number of barrels?
It's not a lot.
1,000? 10,000?
I can't say, but
Can't tell.
yeah, it's.
John, if you rich investor friend wants to buy more bourbon, I can sell you barrels, and they're old.
Right over here.
Thanks. This question is for John. Obviously, the Old Scouts are really good, and the Contradiction is really good. So you're blending really well, and you're also choosing barrels that are really good. But your average person might think, you know, you started in 2008, you came from a different industry. Like, what qualifies this person to choose these barrels? So in 2008, when you were choosing these barrels, did you just get lucky? Did you have consultants helping you, or did you just really get good fast?
I think it was a little bit of all those things. We weren't. I was the one that ultimately decided on the high rye whiskey. I knew, again, when I tasted it, I knew I wanted it, or I smelled it, I knew I wanted it. But I did have some people back me up and say, hey, this is really good whiskey. Some of it was the fact that MGPI makes great product, and that we did get lucky. And then some of it was we worked pretty hard to make sure that when that whiskey went into a bottle, that it was untouched or we didn't mess around with it a whole lot. So we blend the barrels we like, but you know, unlike a lot of people, we don't chill filter. So when you drink our whiskey and you get this big creamy mouthfeel and it doesn't feel as hot as 99 proof, we thought that was right? We were taking a chance. And we get flock. You guys know what flock is, right? Where you see the cloudiness in the bottle. We get flock in our rye, and occasionally we get it in our bourbon. But we think it's important for that because you get those differences, right? So I think a little bit of it is of all of those things. We had some good expertise. We think we knew what we were doing pretty early on with whiskey, and we had some good help. You guys should know that it wouldn't come as a shock to maybe some of you guys, but we think MGPI is so good that we hired their old production manager / master distiller, a guy named Larry Ebersold, to help us. So he helps taste new distillate. He helped with our new column. So we rely on a lot of people to help us out. We've sent samples to other guys who are the industry on the production side, really super friendly. So
Great, thanks.
yeah, thanks.
We have several questions over here. I believe this gentleman was first.
David, you mentioned 13 separate mash bills, which is mind-boggling to me. Are all of those going towards straight bourbon or straight rye?
No, it's a collection. We make a wheated bourbon. We have a wheat whiskey. We have the old standard products, the 21% rye, the 36% rye. We have a 51% rye. Let's see. We have 100% malt bash, I think. I'm forgetting the rest, but yeah, there's wide variations. I think there's probably about 6 bourbons and 6 whiskeys.
Does that include your light whiskey? Because you guys are heavy on
Yeah,
light whiskey.
that would
right now.
include that. One of the 13 is light whiskey. Yeah,
Okay.
which is for most of you may not know, it's a blending component.
Get ready for it. Light whiskey's going to be in a store near you. Lots of it. This gentleman was next.
I guess I have 2 questions. Second for Fred, but first for Mr. Dykstra. John mentioned looking at the Scottish model of sort of being a merchant bottler, or lack of a better word, a negociant. Why is the American whiskey industry so afraid to embrace the Scottish model? You look at Blackadder and they'll say, Blackadder, 1991, 21 years old, Glencairn or Auchentoshan. Why can't it say Old Scout, 7 years old, MGPI?
I think, honestly, it was originally just oversight. I don't think anyone intentionally didn't say distilled in Indiana, or I really do believe those laws are they're very long. They're books. They're not. It's not.
Is there
just
not
a
a will
book.
to change it, you think?
I think everyone will comply. I mean, obviously, with the Templeton settlement this week, it's going to. Other people will put where products were distilled. No one wants to, pay $3 a bottle to eat for everyone who comes up and says they bought it. So I don't think that'll be an issue going forward.
I'd like to add to that, largely people didn't care, and when you look at American whiskey, point to me a time in which you had people who were going to conferences to talk about it. It didn't start until the 90s, so this appreciation and genuine love for American whiskey in terms of our popular culture, with the exception of a few films in the 1950s and 1960s, is new. And so, no one gave a flying fart where their whiskey was coming from in 1950. They just knew it was 8 years old and it was good. And so that's kind of, in my opinion, and I used that example in the historic sense with Chopin and Gore. No one gave a shit about, their false marketing in the 1950s. Today we care, because we're passionate about the brands. I mean, they were passionate back then, but they weren't describing tasting notes. They were like, it's smooth, it's not going to knock you out, it's not kickback whiskey. So today we just have a greater appreciation for American whiskey, and rightly so. We're a newer country than Scotland.
Right. And just to follow up,
I do just want to add one other thing, is that the laws are very difficult. And just to add a little bit more to that, we employ 2 people full time to keep us in compliance, and a law firm that we pay. So I think it's just, I think in defense of our customers, it's just very difficult to make. It shouldn't be, but I think in some cases it's just pure oversight that they don't comply with the labeling laws.
and I guess my last question would be, and maybe Wade, you could wade in too, is why, at risk of sounding sacrilegious, why does Willet get such a pass when Old Scout gets kind of raked over the coals a little bit? It feels like Willet's been bottling and saying family bottled estate rye, 8 years old. Same with Bullet too.
Bullet. You know what? I think that
It just seems like, I mean,
there's a lot of brands
that get a pass.
that that may seem to get a pass, but like in my new book, my next book coming out, I mean, no one's getting a pass. Like I think it's a matter of who it is and what circle it is, and the fact is Willets did. There's a reason why Evan Colsfien is in the Bourbon Hall of Fame. That man selected stocks when they were privately bottling for people that no one else could select. His palate is on the level of, and maybe even surpasses Julian Van Winkle, of being able to taste one barrel and says that it should go next to that barrel. Evan does not go out in public, but in the inner circles of the bourbon world, everybody knows that they've been aging whiskey forever. They stopped distilling. They've had some ins and outs in the business. They tried to convert their plant to a gasohol plant. Didn't work out. They had some other issues, and they're back now. So I think a lot of it is a historical connection, but also the contemporary connection of Evan really being a damn good mingler or blender or whatever you want to call him. In terms of Bullet, if you guys want to say they're getting a pass, I mean, I guess I'm in a different world. I see them constantly getting persecuted for. Well, I mean, I think 10 years ago, in the magazines I write for were calling him out for being made at Four Roses. I mean, Chuck Cowdery's book came out in 2004 and disclosed that that they were actually made at Four Roses. Four Roses would have a special tour, and there would be a Bullet bourbon sample like sitting out in the lab. I mean, the whiskey was good. People liked it, and I feel like that is one that is like the kind of the term that was used at the Kentucky Bourbon Festival quite often, was that it was the worst kept secret in the industry. And if you ever press Tom Bullet on the whole matter, he would say, he's not allowed to talk about it. And Tom's a lawyer, so he's very smart with his words. Tom's great, and he'll tell you the mash bill. He'll tell you we were contract distilling there with Four Roses, and so it's not. I mean, these things aren't bad. Sometimes it's like the marketing managers, kind of like Wade was talking about in his presentation. A marketing manager, a distributor says it'll sell better if we say this, and the fact is, during the lawsuit, Templeton's sales never went down. Sales for brands that are getting sued or get called out, no one really cares in terms of the mainstream. And in terms of the liquor stores, you're lucky if the attendant that takes care of the bourbon aisle even shows up on Friday. So, you're in terms of a national scene, it's about what people like, and in terms of who gets a pass in my circle, I think that Bullet has been one that's been brought out very frequently, and Diageo has handled it how they handle it, but now they're a little bit more forthcoming about their past, and soon they'll have a distillery, and they won't have to answer that question anymore. So
I've got one thing to add. That is, they're not out of compliance. Right, because if it's made in the same state, you don't have to list it. So if somebody bought stuff from MGPI in Indiana and they were in another part of Indiana, they wouldn't have to list the state of distillation because they are in the current state in which the product was made.
And oh, by the way,
and I'll add to that, the Bullet Rye says distilled in Indiana.
Yeah.
So they do properly follow the 5.36D compliant.
We have Marty over here with Glencairn, whom I wish we had their glasses for these fine tastings.
Please keep the applause down. Thank you. Yes. First off, David, I've been to MGP a couple times, and it's a fantastic place. I always get pissed off when I see articles calling it a factory. It's a distillery, and it's one of the most amazing distilleries I've ever seen. You guys do a great job there.
It's true.
I also think that a lot of this stuff is kind of geared towards the geekdom of whiskey. Calling a lot, yeah, Mr. Little crown of geek over there. In fact, one of the things I find interesting, and Fred, we've discussed this,
Allegedly.
that we keep holding whiskey to a certain standard. Why do we keep whiskey to a certain standard when we know for a fact that Keebler cookies are not made by elves and hollowed out trees? So that is on TV. But we give a shit where a whiskey, what state a whiskey's in. When I agree with David, it's more who's blending it. It's so you take this whiskey and it's the guys who create it, I think, is more important than what state it originates from.
By the way, the Keebler elf thing was
Texas
brought up.
is excused.
That was brought up in the Maker's Mark case. The
Keebler elves?
judge's closing argument on that, or whatever his final statement was.
That was
like,
me, Fred.
You told the judge.
I was in his chambers.
I actually do believe you have those powers. So.
But I mean, why do we hold whiskey to a different standard than just about everything else?
Well, let
and
me ask
actually
you
more
this.
American whiskey, because John Jameson never jumped in and wrestled. What was it? An octopus for a? Once again.
But those are so fantastic. Who can actually believe
think?
them?
Well,
Anyways.
I think whiskey's held to a higher standard because it's an American institution, and I think that's really it. That's why everyone is so passionate about it.
We are very passionate about it. I mean, who here subscribes to the Vodka magazine? Does it exist? No. There's a bourbon magazine or blog popping up every other week. So passion drives all of this. We have a gentleman back here in a light pink hat. Yes.
Well, if we're going to be official, it's Nantucket Red. But anyhow, I have a couple things that I wanted to say and ask, and I guess I sort of feel like as an industry, we spend a lot of time talking about the puffery on the labels, right? And I think that a lot of these lawsuits and a lot of the questions and statements that we're kind of looking at and batting around today are really based on what the consumer expects. And a lot of us sort of blow off kind of like, oh, the ridiculousness of these class action lawsuits. Why is whiskey held to a higher standard? And it doesn't really matter what we as an industry and as producers and distillers and so forth think. It's consumer expectation. And I think, we look at the fact that Tom Bullitt now sits in Pappy Van Winkle's office. Maybe ironic, maybe not.
We have 1 minute, sir.
Sure.
We got the
and sort of the recanting of kind of granddaddy's old recipe. And I think kind of one of the most telling things is that sort of that contrast between sort of the fact and what the spirits marketers are saying. And so I kind of wanted to quote a poster that sits in Stitzelweller right now, which says, "No chemists allowed!" Exclamation point. Nature and the old-time know-how of a master distiller get the job done here, because traditional Kentucky whiskey is a natural product. We disdain synthetics, scientists, and their accompanying apparatus. This is a distillery, not a whiskey factory. And that, to me, is a little bit disturbing a little disgusting. You know, it kind of speaks to kind of why do we hold American whiskey to a higher standard? You know, if we're going to allow the marketers to run wild, then where is the goddamn integrity?
Well, I'll tell you,
And quite frankly, I think we all expect better, and I don't
Yeah.
think if we're focused on quality like we should be, there's no reason that we shouldn't expect better. And it's things like that that I kind of think speak to the mind of the American consumer and where we as an industry should be headed. And I think it's a very powerful thing and something that we need to think about. And if we are going to let these marketers run wild, then guess what? We're going to have more class action lawsuits. We're going to have more consumers
And
who are angry.
I will tell you that people who have retired from Stitzel-Weller, the last living man to work with Pappy Van Winkle, the last distiller at Stitzel-Weller, the descendants of Pappy Van Winkle, the people who worked at George T. Stagg, all of the old-timers feel the same way.
Are they proud to have Tom Bullitt in Pappy Van Winkle's office? That's an important
They've
question.
actually are appreciative. Many of them are appreciative of the fact that Diageo has even saved the distillery before the cobwebs got it. And I'll tell you that James Espy, who's the founder of the Keeper of the Quake, he told me the problem with all whiskey, we're talking Scotch, Irish, American, Canadian, everything, is the bonus allotment to the executives of the publicly traded companies, of which are pushing no age statement whiskeys down our throat, are pushing flavored whiskeys down our throat. So that is where the issue lies. It's with the people who are trying to get $2.5 million bonuses at the end of the year. It is not with the distillers. And it's not necessarily with the marketers, because 25 years ago, or 30, 40 years ago, when my friend Edwin Foote, the last distiller of Old Fitzgerald, was making whiskey, guess who wasn't buying it? Everybody. So the marketers are important. And if the marketers are not important to some degree, then Maker's Mark, which is the one brand that really brought back bourbon, Maker's Mark is not in existence today. Because, boy, let me tell you, Bill Samuels can spin yarn. So I think healthy marketing is good for whiskey. What's bad for whiskey?
But is fabrication good for whiskey? And is it good for whiskey branding and for consumer perception? I mean, because it's consumer perception. That's a serious thing.
As the doors open and our lovely seminar comes to a close.
Integrity in American whiskey, folks.
We are happy to contact you after the seminar. We could talk all day. Thank you for the questions there, Pink Hat. I loved them. Come up. You've got my card there. You've got Smooth Ambler. Come up, get your pictures, whatever you want to do with David. Thank you so much for coming. Cheers.